advanced to the table where her fiancé Faisal sat with his deputies. Working, planning, scheming, whatever he did to occupy his time. It was clearly more important than the festival. Whatever, not my problem. They were a year into the trial marriage, and he barely knew her name. She unconsciously touched her still flat stomach. While all High Minister Faisal wasn't entirely disinterested in her physically, he had made it clear he was far more interested in her connections and ability to help run his increasingly complex household. She watched him stuff a handful of spider legs in his mouth, spilling bits of the crispy fried skin down the front of his tunic as he attempted to chew, talk, and point at ledgers all at the same time. Somehow, she figured she would manage to survive his inattention. She switched partners. It was a man only a couple inches taller than herself, light skin like hers but with grey-blue eyes and jet-black hair. He looked exotic. She must have stared too long, because he winked at her before handing her off to the next partner. Jenny smiled more, might as well have as much fun as she could. It was odd, but she was actually happier now that she'd accepted reality. She was going to marry Faisal, probably have a dozen of his kids and die in childbirth. The fate of the highborn. Well, highborn women. She added one of the optional flourishes in the circle dance. Faisal was still balls deep in his schemes. He was a pig, but at least a busy pig, and he was an important minister. Important enough to have to make an appearance at festivals, and busy enough to pass off the social duties to his newest wife-to-be. 6 hearths with 4 festivals each year. She was practically living the life of a wandering merchant. His first 2 wives even went by themselves to represent him fairly often, so why not make the most out of a short life? Indulge in the vices at the various festivals. Her soon-to-be husband was too busy to attend it. Wasn't like she was going to love long enough to suffer in old age. They finished the circle and split off to the waiting mates, and it was the same pale, blue-eyed, black-haired man. Jenny must have done a double take. She didn't know the calculations offhand, but was fairly certain it wasn't a thing to repeat partners in a group this big. He gave her hand a squeeze before releasing her to the next partner. Jenny added another optional flourishes. Her back was turned before she could see a reaction. She loved the music and dancing. It was as close to performance art as she was allowed. It wasn't much, but at least she had something. Back to the circles. Faisal had moved from the table, probably went to find some local official. He was already in the highest ranking position of merit in Krakatoa. But if there was some way to move higher, she was relatively certain he'd find a way. At least that would keep him busy. Plus, he could always get more wives, apparently, maybe even higher-ranking ones. All the more reason to forget her. They broke the circle, and the same man a 3rd time. Okay, this definitely wasn't by chance. He smiled widely, looking her straight in the eyes. What did he see? Jenny smiled back automatically. There's a vice to indulge in. The man was openly admiring more than just her dancing skills, and she returned the attention. He was average to below average height and slim. Maybe not a full-blown masculine hero like the Plinians in her romance stories, but he was still more than handsome enough for a more entertaining few minutes in bed than Faisal offered. Her smile deepened at the thought. What an adventure that would be, sneaking another man into her chambers, right under her boorish fiancé's nose. Then the smile wavered as she did another double take. Did the man have no chords, no optional flourishes from her this time? She barely kept in step with the strong drum beat. A hearthless at a festival? Or at least a hearthless in the same area of the festival as her? Maybe it wouldn't have been so out of place in a backwater shithole hearth like Kone, but she'd thought Actual was fairly advanced for Krakatoa. Until now. She glanced around at the other dancers. No one else seemed bothered by his presence, proving she still had a lot to get used to in her new home. She was broken out of her thoughts by the hearthless man again meeting up with her. This time he brushed her hand with his when they broke into the pair dance. He was definitely flirting. His unwavering focus on her, as much as his delicate and exotic handsomeness, almost made her want to flirt back. He stepped in close with an optional flourish. A bold one that usually only experienced and intimate dancers tried. He swept her up in one arm and twirled her around. She was shocked at his strength. He looked far more lean than Faisal, and barely average height, but he held her against himself easily with the one arm. She didn't even need to cling to him for balance, but was tempted to nonetheless. They risked falling behind the beat as he held her just a little too close, her body sliding against his as he lowered her to the floor. While Faisal had a bulky, forced athletic build, she felt the definition in this man's lean muscles even through the clothes. They broke away and returned to the circle. Jenny felt a thrill, like what she'd hoped to feel when Faisal had first taken her to bed. With a hearthless, really, she was suddenly embarrassed. She was a noble, and even though she was barely maintaining that exalted status with this marriage, she was at least marrying into wealth and power. Granted, it wasn't like Faisal was going to notice 10 minutes of flirting in a festival dance. Probably wouldn't notice if she kissed the man right there in the middle of the dance floor. But if she was going to have an affair, she was certain she had better options than a hearthless. The circle was the last one of the song. As the dancers broke apart, she saw the exotic, heartless man wander off to talk with the musicians and the culture craft singer priest, Rabindranath. He turned back and winked at her again before turning his full attention back to the crafters. She watched him curiously for a moment. Even by Krakatoan standards, he was an odd man. She returned to their table. Faisal was gone, but an underling desperately needed her help to smooth over some churlish remarks Faisal had made which were causing heartburn with the hearth's assigned pinions. Kone only 2 of the streetlights were out on the school street. This was clearly in one of the better neighborhoods of Kone, though of course that wasn't saying much. Most of the streets on their short trip from the Hadamard were more lit by natural-growing luminescent mushrooms than the ancient artificial lights. If she didn't have the utmost faith in their ancestors' engineering skill, she might have been worried the entire cave roof would collapse on them. But even Kone wasn't in quite that advanced state of disrepair. Jenny's servant met the school headmaster at the door. They very quickly negotiated the exact pomp and circumstance her entrance should cause. The headmaster held open the door together with the servant, while they sent the 2 Plinian guards ahead to stand at attention inside. Jenny gripped her thick linen portfolio in one hand, and lifted her skirts just enough with the other to not trip on the stone stairs up to the door. She nodded politely at the headmaster on the way in, and gave a gracious head nod to the gaggle of students in equal awe of her, and the Plinian guards, though barely more than boys. They did look striking, mysterious and dangerous with their uniform, and bright blue Elogast tattoos. A little girl, probably 7 or 8, stuck her tongue out. "Impertinent little brat," Jenny returned the expression. The girl grinned a gap-toothed smile and giggled to her companions. "Thank you for tending to our grant application directly." The headmaster simpered as he fell in beside Jenny. "Would you like a tour first?" "Of course," Jenny nodded. She had had worse tours in her life, but not many. While she was a general fan of the culture craft, it was more for the end product. She discovered quickly that she had little interest in the nuts, bolts, or mechanics of musical production. They traipsed through endless classrooms of students of varying abilities. She did have to admit the school was impressive for what it was. They had students ranging from basically toddlers to middle-aged culture craft masters, and they seemed to teach everything from voice to was that a piano. She paused by a room with an ajar door. Most of the classrooms were covered in thick, sound-dampening cloths, thick carpets on the stone floors, heavy drapes on the walls, and linen padding everywhere else, an obvious necessity to keep the sounds from echoing throughout the structure. But the open door let the rich sounds of the piano escape just enough to catch her attention. The headmaster droned on about the continued support from the famous Father Rabindranath all these decades after his apprenticeship at the school. Jenny veered off course into the piano room. She had once heard Father Rabindranath play a concert in Rano, years ago, before he had joined the church. She wasn't sure if the student sounded just as good as the musician-turned-priest, or if she just didn't know enough about the craft. As far as she knew, there were only 3 pianos left in the world, and none in Krakatoa. Why wasn't this on the tour? The sounds of the tour were left behind as she entered the room. The musician was facing away from the door, so she watched him sway and bob his dark-haired head along with the music. The jet-black hair and skin somehow paler than hers. He stopped and turned around. It was the same heartless man she danced with at the festival last week. The Ibarra School of Music is so egalitarian as to let those without status study here, she said as she strode further into the room. She tucked her portfolio under one arm and ran a curious hand along the piano. As she walked past him, the Ibarra School of Music is so meritocratic as to let anyone who is qualified teach here, he answered, getting up from the bench and following her. His tone, haughty enough to match her own, surprised her. She paused and lifted an eyebrow at him, as much as his clear insubordination should have offended her. She found herself smiling for some reason, an unbidden memory of the exotically handsome man letting her back down to the floor. Sliding against his lean body leapt to the forefront of her mind. Oh, never mind, that's the reason. Jenny turned and looked at the man over her shoulder. He was standing tall, also resting his hand on the piano, and returning her look with the same amount of natural confidence she had. And then some. The more defiant he was, oddly, the more it intrigued rather than annoyed her. The Lord Crater is being pressured to invest more into Kone, Jenny said, walking away from him, but staying close enough to the piano to run her fingers along the smooth wood. It was clearly ancient. The wood alone would have cost a fortune, and she wasn't sure the techniques to stain and polish it still existed even in history texts anymore. He followed her, staying a few steps behind, but seemingly not letting her get too far from himself. He is trying to mend fences with the Plinian consort, Jenny continued. And my fiancé is adamant that Kone has absolutely nothing to offer besides this school. He's probably right, the exotic man answered. His voice had an odd cadence to it. He was perfectly intelligible, but his speech patterns seemed to have the same exotic quality that the rest of his appearance did. Why should a school with a piano need more funding? She asked bluntly. And apparently a piano that is taken enough for granted, it couldn't be included on a tour for the representative of the First Minister of Krakatoa. This is a baby piano, the man answered, as if that meant something. The grand piano's on the 3rd floor, he continued. I'm sure it will be a seminal stop on the tour. 2 pianos? Jenny asked. She clutched her portfolio to her chest, and couldn't stop her eyes from widening. Why are you petitioning the Lord for money? The man ran his hand fondly along the instrument. Because it takes a team of highly skilled craftsmen to maintain them. He answered simply. Such as yourself, she asked. Is this why you're not in the culture craft? A skill too niche to fit into the system? I'm only a performer, he said with a little laugh. Still, she pressed, why aren't you in the culture craft? Why don't you have any rank at all? She continued, to clutch the portfolio and walk around the piano, and he continued to follow her, staying always within 2 steps of her, and yet not crowding her somehow. You're from Rano, he stated. She feigned surprise. You know who I am. You did say you're here on behalf of your affianced. The First Minister of Krakatoa, he answered with an easy smile. He has 3 wives already. Jenny answered with her own easy smile. That doesn't narrow it down. You are the Lady Jenny Vesuviora, the 3rd daughter of Lord Jacari Vesuviorum of Rano, he said, his tone turning serious. He paused as they had made a complete circuit around the piano. Jenny paused as well. And you are? She asked with a lifted eyebrow. She purposefully ignored his misranking of her. Though the daughter of a lord, she wasn't a lady. Topher, he answered quickly, but seemed to stop himself from adding something else. I'm a vocal and instrumental instructor here at the Ibarra School of Music. He inclined his head towards her. It seemed to be as close to a bow as he would get, though he concentrated on her with an attention that somehow came across as more admiring than the quiescent bowing she had become accustomed to. She looked quickly to the door, amazed no one had noticed the primary recipient had dropped out from the tour. She wouldn't have been surprised if she had travelled with Faisal, but she had to admit it was a slight blow to her self-confidence that no one seemed to have noticed yet. And yet you're heartless, she said bluntly, determined to get down to the bottom of this. Heartless is relative, Topher answered. He closed the gap between them, taking a seat backwards on the piano bench and inviting her to sit next to him. She did so, though she wasn't sure why. She settled herself on the bench, primly balancing the portfolio on her lap. His sheer abject confidence was as mesmerizing as it was off-putting. "I'm not sure that's right," she started. "As a term, you use it to refer to people without status," he answered, shifting his weight to turn towards her. "You don't differentiate between those with no status at all and those who just have status elsewhere." "There's no elsewhere." Jenny nearly laughed out loud. He merely looked upward. She did laugh out loud. "The surface?" she blurted out, nearly snorting out of her nose in pure unladylike mirth. Fairy tales were filled with stories of exotic people, foolish or stubborn enough to remain up there. "No one can live there," she said between laughs. "The ancients blacked out the sun centuries ago. Anyone foolish enough to go there is cursed with cancer within hours." He only held her gaze, not arguing, not protesting, just listening and watching. His attention not pulled for a second in any other direction. "It's dangerous," she finished, turning sober again and returning his look. "You seem like someone who would like a little danger in their life," Topher replied, a coy smile painting his delicate features. She stared at him, focusing hard on observing his features, so she wouldn't betray just how correct that statement was. She realized just how beautiful his large, round, steel blue eyes were, framed as they were by his long, dark eyelashes. A little vacant, yes, but there was a touch of something deeper. He reached out and took her hand, inching closer to her on the bench. Jenny felt an involuntary shiver run through her body. She withdrew her hand, hoping he hadn't noticed. She didn't want to give this uppity man, with no status, the satisfaction of being right. He inched closer again. She didn't inch away, despite there being not only an entire foot of bench on the other side of her, there was an entire school, and presumably people expecting her outside the room. "Who wants danger?" she asked in a low voice. Topher inched ever more closer, taking up her hand again. "Danger is just that," she said even lower. "It's dangerous. Not exciting," she told herself. Not thrilling. Not a way to break up the monotony of her future husband's work with some well-deserved drama. He held up her pale hand, encompassing it in his own musician-delicate hands, with their fine fingers. "The life of a lady is dangerous too," he said, matching her low tone. "Only if you think I could die from boredom." She almost laughed again, but his light caresses on the back of her hand were putting her in an entirely different mood from humor. "Sounds deathly to me," he murmured, caressing her hand and bringing it up to his lips. "How about a taste of danger?" He kissed the back of her hand. Jenny never would have thought such an innocent act could lead her to some truly guttural thoughts. He could taste some other things. She started to withdraw her hand again. Topher held on to it and looked at her through his dark eyelashes. She fought a flush as she felt the sensation of moisture in places. Moisture had no busy being. She was more ready for this inexplicably arrogant, statusless man than she had ever been for Faisal. More than even for the men she'd known before Faisal. She withdrew her hand from his slender, grasping fingers. "There's literally nothing else in Coney for the Lord to invest in," Jenny announced as she stood up. She flicked some imaginary dust from her fine, pink silk overskirt. The multitude of puffy underskirts swayed with the motion, and Topher, the hearthless music instructor, made no moves to hide his appreciation of the sight of the high-born noble. "This school is guaranteed to win the grant," Jenny went on. "A representative from the school will be expected to sign the contracts," she explained as she willed herself to turn her back on him. "And go find the headmaster to finish the tour. If you rank high enough for the trip, maybe I will see you in Crater." She was proud of herself for not looking back, though God knew why she was tempted. Crater Jenny had actually been disappointed today. Well, she was disappointed most days when she wasn't traveling, and thus was stuck with perfunctory hostess duties at Faisal's estate, or perfunctory calculation duties at Lord Herschel Krakataram's residence. But today she'd been extra disappointed when Kendall Coniorum had shown up to formally accept a grant for the Ibarra School of Music. He gave a lovely speech about how the money would support scholarships for the underprivileged, and she spent the entire time fixated on why a particular underprivileged, pale, dark-featured, handsome man wasn't there. So much for danger. She settled in her private alcove, in a semi-appropriate dressing gown, with her wine and novel featuring ladies and plinians, and the sort of salacious escapade she was feeling increasingly entitled to. The alcove was as outside as anything in the vast underground hearth could be. The sitting area was carved directly into the wall of the huge man-made cavern. While it was partially shielded by a lattice with creeping vines and luminescent fungi, the top of the lattice was still open enough for her to see out into Faisal's gardens, and the rest of the hearth beyond his sizable property. She could see the streets beginning to dim for the night and individual home lights go on, and a figure scaling Faisal's garden wall with alarming ease. Wine and novel forgotten, she clutched the dressing gown around her chest, stood and peered through the unfilled holes of the lattice. The figure dashed through the garden, pausing and checking for guards periodically as he headed straight for her. Jenny considered going inside. She told herself to go inside. "What's wrong with you?" She could have sworn she saw a flash of pale skin and dark hair, that's what. She didn't have time to ruminate on her poor decision as the figure disappeared from view under her alcove. She heard rustling as he was clearly scaling the story-high rock wall. She glanced at the novel, almost certain this was lifted straight from a scene of that classic work, then was shocked to see a pale face staring at her from the other side of the lattice. "Lady," Topher nodded at Jenny. Jenny fumbled with her dressing gown, unsure whether the bold, hearthless man's appearance meant she could relax since it was who she expected, or if she definitely ought not relax, given how clear he had made his intentions back at the school. She stared back at him, at an utter loss for words. He seemed to balance with little to no effort on some ledge she couldn't see, and 100% of his attention was on her. "I decided to take your invitation to visit literally," he said, cocking his head to peer through an empty diamond of the lattice. "May I join you?" he asked, as he offered an exaggerated one-armed half-bow. "How?" Jenny asked in turn, his delicate features screwed in some deep contemplation. "My people tend to take these sorts of yes or no questions quite seriously," he explained. He swung himself around to the front of the alcove, and with one outstretched arm, fiddled with something until the lattice split in the middle, and one side swung open. "But given what I know of the hearths," he continued his explanation, as he climbed onto the carved stone alcove to join her, "I think your question of how was a tacit acceptance of the action itself." He closed the lattice quickly behind him, fumbled with the hidden latch on the outside, and tested it to make sure it was secure before turning his full attention to her again. "I didn't know that opened," Jenny muttered, fixating on the least important detail of this encounter. "That is a particularly delicate species of vine," he explained, "which requires periodically repotting in the soil beds and retraining of the vine through the lattice. All the outside lattices were designed to open to facilitate this." She raised an eyebrow. "After I was turned away from the residence this morning, I spent a considerable amount of time hunting down your husband's staff," he explained, taking one of the seats and gesturing to offer her own seat to her. "Your gardeners are quite talkative." He grinned up at her. Jenny fought herself from being pulled in, but damn it, his smile was just so genuine. "He's happy to see me." She wondered why that thought should be so foreign to her. Sure, Faisal didn't have the time of day for her, but it wasn't exactly like she was seeking out his sloppy affections. She just stood there, looking down into Topher's big blue eyes. His smile wavered, and he popped to his feet. "I apologize, lady," he said with a formal bow. As he rose again, he started to pull a white envelope from his tunic breast fold. "For invading my privacy or for wanting to see me?" she asked. The question came out colder than she had intended. He returned the envelope to his pocket and stepped up close to her. Too close to her. Much too close. "The first," he murmured. "Only the first." He was so close he could have whispered in her ear. "And sincerely apologize for what I'm not sorry for," he continued, his voice dropping so low she more felt the words than heard them. "You seem—" He caught his breath. "So lonely." Jenny felt him take her hand. She didn't pull it back. "I am," she answered, though she doubted the words were even audible. His arms encircled her waist, and his lips were on hers in one smooth motion. Jenny didn't hesitate, not even for a fraction of a second. She pulled her arms out from his embrace and wrapped them around his neck to pull his face down. even more. His kiss went from a light, gentle touch to insistent exploration. She returned every ounce of his passion with two of her own. She ran her fingers through his silky short hair. He ran a hand down the single braid of her hair that hung to her waist. And then his hand lingered there on her waist and below. How's this for danger? She kissed him with even more passion as she slid her arms back inside his embrace and ran her fingers over the front of his tunic. Cheating on her fiancé? The most cliché of dangers for a noble woman. Topher backed up slightly. They were close enough to continue the kiss, but had just enough room to allow her to tug his belt loose. He pulled away, looking from the belt laying on the stone to her face. And then, grinning so broadly, the expression took over his whole face as he moved in again, and finally returned her full passion. He tugged at her own dressing gown strings, and slid a hand inside. He ran his fingers over and under her flimsy nightdress. He pulled down the front to expose a breast, and concentrated momentarily on playing with the nipple. Jenny almost moaned out loud and steered him backward until he hit the chair. A nobleman could have his wife executed for producing illegitimate offspring. Jenny pushed Topher into the chair, and he tugged at her waist with one hand to force her down with him. He was surprisingly strong as he hiked up her skirt and tugged her legs around to straddle him. Good thing I'm already pregnant. She was all for living dangerously. But maybe not that dangerously. Jenny felt Topher's erection underneath his pants, the only barrier between them. She pulled open his tunic to expose his chest, and explored his skin as much as he was exploring hers. His skin was smooth, not just a lack of manly body hair, but the skin was also soft. She caressed his firm chest and defined abdomen. He pulled down the front of her gown more, and pulled her down close, her chest smothering his face. He found a nipple with his mouth, and used his tongue to play this time as he used one hand to grip her buttocks and the other to run delicate fingers over and around her exposed nub. Jenny did moan now. Topher arched back and paused in his explorations to tug his pants down. Again with that surprising strength, he somehow held up her weight as he guided himself inside of her, an easy task given she was practically dripping. Still, he didn't rush it. He just held her up and let her down slow, before pushing her up and starting again, inch by inch, down his entire shaft. He looked her in the eyes the entire time. If his overt attention towards her had been some sort of heartless scam, he was well past the point of needing to maintain it now. He kept his gaze firmly on her as he started to undulate, guiding her on top of him. Jenny ran her hands on his smooth chest and basked in the waves of pleasure coursing over her. His hands flew all over her body, like a kid at a candy stall who just wanted a taste of everything. A soft knock on the door to her bedroom started to open. Jenny paused in horror. Topher reached out and slapped the door closed before it could open. "I have your dinner, mistress," her maid called from inside. Topher gripped Jenny's buttocks with his remaining hand, continuing to guide her hips in a grind against him. "Just set it in my dining room," Jenny gasped. The thrill of nearly being caught added another dimension to her pleasure. "I can set it up for you out there," the maid continued. The door rattled. Topher continued to push it shut and grinned up at Jenny as he never stopped his undulating motion. "I think the door is stuck," the maid said, rattling the door more insistently. "The dining room, please," Jenny breathed. She couldn't even think of an excuse, much less a good one. One more door rattle, and the maid gave up. "As you wish, ma'am." Topher held the door shut until they heard her footsteps retreat completely. Then he grabbed her and pushed his face into her breasts. Jenny groaned as she felt the elusive climax she had read and heard so much about start to take over. Topher seemed to sense it, and he rushed to run a thumb over her most sensitive area, making her explode in a wash of pure joy, running over and through her whole body. He let out his own deep moan as she felt him throb and shudder inside. They gripped each other close through the aftershocks of the pleasure. Finally, Jenny rested her head on his shoulder, reluctant to let go. "A sigh of service," Topher whispered in her ear. Jenny pushed herself up and looked at him. "For your loneliness," he clarified, reaching up to brush escaped hairs from her face. "Very much so," she answered, leaning down to kiss him softly. She pushed herself up again. Now, for the awkward part of separating themselves, and adjusted clothes back to decency. Again, seeming to read her mind, Topher pulled out a handkerchief from his inside tunic pocket, as Jenny used it to hastily wipe herself down and stand up. She noticed the white envelope hanging halfway out of the tunic pocket. "Were you trying to give that to me earlier?" she asked, pointing at the envelope. Topher actually flushed, his pale skin turning a cute shade of pink. He, a man with no standing in the world, was standing tunic open, pants down, manhood exposed, on the private grounds of a noble with said noble's affianced, who was also mostly naked, and he was embarrassed by an envelope. She hastily adjusted herself, pulling the nightdress back up over her breasts and back down over her hips, and closed the dressing gown. She snatched the envelope like he was trying to keep it away from her. He let her have it as he worked on dressing himself. Jenny opened it and skimmed the letter inside. "A petition for a court case?" she asked, letting her arm with the letter fall to her side. So, she struggled with the thought. This was just some elaborate plot. Topher flushed more and smoothed out some wrinkles in his tunic before tying it back with the belt. "For what end?" Jenny demanded. She waved the letter at him. "This whole thing was a setup to try to get my fiancé to file a court case for you?" She levied a judgmental gaze on him. "You planned this whole thing?" Topher looked down, for the first time looking like a heartless, ashamed, and out of place in her presence. He nodded. "Why?" she demanded again. "It's for my cousin," he said, looking up again and into her eyes. Despite the ruse being up, he was still giving her all his attention. "She was taken by a Plinian, so go to the post," Jenny replied, still at a loss of why he felt the need to do all this. To do any of it, really. "The Plinian that took her was Incio Hacker," he replied just as quickly. Jenny drew her mouth in a tight line. "Okay, it was at least starting to make sense. And you figured my husband to be's famous dislike for that man meant he would file a case on your behalf." Topher nodded again. He seemed to be recovering some of his natural haughty airs. Christ, where had this guy come from? She was starting to believe his wild implication of being from the surface. No one raised in a hearth could possibly misinterpret literally everything this much. "Why not give it to him directly?" Jenny asked. The question came out more as a sigh. "Well, one," Topher gestured at his left shoulder, "and the lack of cords." Jenny was forced to nod in agreement. It wasn't like a hearthless could just approach a noble normally. "And two, don't take this the wrong way," Topher started. She braced herself. Those were words only spoken directly before something was about to be taken. Very put her hands on her hips. "But Faisal, Minister Faisal, isn't really much better than Hagar." Topher finished with a cute half-smile and hapless shrug, clearly bracing himself as well for her to take that the wrong way. Jenny laughed. Topher looked confused. "I would argue they're probably equal in awfulness," she answered. Topher's sheepish half-smile turned into a full beam. "Rabin suggested I try to go through one of the wives, and he mentioned you as a particular matron for the culture crowd. I was confident I could convince you to help her if I could just talk to you alone," he explained. "You definitely don't seem to be lacking confidence," she muttered. "Lucky for you, Faisal hates the Plinian Incio enough to do something decent by accident," she said, as she stuffed the letter back in the envelope. "It'll be on his desk by the morning, and your case will be filed by the end of the day," she promised him. Relief spread over his face. He wasn't old, a few years older than herself, maybe 30 at most, but what looked like years of worry melted away. "Thank you," he said sincerely. He eyed the lattice. This did seem like his cue to escape into the night, never to darken her doorstep again. "But why did you think seducing me would convince me to help your cousin?" she asked. He flushed again but recovered quickly. "As you said, I'm confident in my abilities." "You're lying," Jenny interrupted him. He flushed a deep pink. She nearly dropped the envelope as she clapped in sheer delight at knocking the arrogant man off his form. "You didn't mean to seduce me?" she said, putting all the clues together finally. "Wow, your cousin was taken by Plinians, and you couldn't stop thinking with your dick for 5 minutes to help her," She put her hands back on her hips and judged him. She was barely above wagging a finger at him. Of course, she couldn't judge him too harshly without considering her own culpability of falling for his accidental seductive art. Topher apparently gave up and just smiled and shrugged. "I'm a flawed man," he admitted. "You're a ridiculous man," she countered. He finally stepped past her and reached for the lattice latch. The vine-covered gate swung open. He turned right before he was about to leave. "Am I an amusing man?" he asked with a hopeful, yet still sheepish little grin. "Enough to tempt you to let me see you again?" His words were joking, but his tone was serious, even a little sad. And as always, he was 100% focused on her. She stepped up and gave him a light kiss on his cheek before returning to her home. The end.